In previous videos, I've shown how to create templates and deploy tasks. In this video, I'm going to illustrate another feature of the Waylay platform. We're going to create sensors. So I'm going to start by hitting the Create Sensor button. And when we do that, we end up in the following UI. On the left-hand side, we see an example sensor with some JavaScript code. And on the right-hand side, we see sensor metadata. And together they form the sensor definition. Now, in this video, I'm not going to use this sample sensor, which is shown here, but I've prepared a small example. And in order not to make too many typos, I will just paste it here and we'll review it together. So the sensor we're going to build is a temperature sensor that makes use of the Open Weather Map API to retrieve the weather conditions of a particular city, including the temperature information. So at the top here, we first check whether the user of the sensor have provided the city as an input. If yes, we construct the URL, which consists of the Open Weather Map URL. We also use the city for which we want to retrieve the weather conditions, and we also specify that we want the results to be returned in metric units. Next, we make use of the JavaScript request package in order to make the HTTP call. And the results of that HTTP call we store in a variable data, and we also log that to the console in order for us to be able to verify whether the API call was executed successfully. Next, we define the variable temperature and we assign the retrieved temperature to that variable. As you may remember, the Waylay platform makes use of discrete states in order to execute logic, so we need to transform the temperature into a number of discrete states. In this example, we make use of 3 discrete states. So if the temperature is bigger than 25, we return the state hot. If it's bigger than 5, we return the state mild, and otherwise we return the state cold. Next, in the sensor definition, we define a variable value, which consists on the one hand of the observed state, and it also includes raw data. So the Waylay framework allows us to store raw data into a task context. Raw data are data that are returned by the API call and that we may want to use into our logic into the designer. So in this particular case, we'll retrieve the continuous variable temperature and put that in the raw data task context, as well as the pressure, which is also returned by the Open Weather Map API. Finally, we'll send back the results. So first we send back the error, which is null in this case, and then we send back the value as defined above. Finally, if the user forgot to specify the city when calling the temperature sensor, we'll return an error message missing property city. So far for the JavaScript definition. Now we'll turn our attention to the metadata. So in terms of metadata, we first need to provide a name for our sensor, so let's call it temp sensor. We also need to provide a version number, so that's a 3-digit number, and whenever we update the sensor, we also need to increment the version number, such you cannot override the previous version of the sensor. We need to provide an author, a category, a documentation URL, and an icon URL. The latter two I will just copy here. So the documentation URL just refers to the documentation from the Open Weather Map, and the icon is just a temperature icon that we found on the internet. I'll just copy paste both here. Next, we need to define the states. So we have here in our example 3 states. So we have the state hot, we have the state mild, and we also add the state cold. So those states are not automatically parsed from the JavaScript, but you need to explicitly define them. Next, we'll define the properties, which are the input parameters to our sensor. So in this case, we have one input parameter, which is the city. We also define the raw data that we put into the task context. So that's, in our case, it's the temperature, as well as the pressure. finally, we have a description field that allows us in HTML format to define some more relevant information about the sensor. So here we'll just put temperature sensor. Okay. Now that we've defined both the JavaScript part as well as the metadata, we can test our scripts. So first we'll execute it without defining the city, and we get indeed an error message. So now we'll retrieve the temperature for Paris, and our sensor now returns a state which is mild. It also puts the temperature 8.6 and the pressure 1020 into the task context. And as you can see in the console output, the sensor returned many more parameters and values as part of the result of the API call. But we've decided to only put the temperature and the pressure into the task context. We could have put more. Okay, so our sensor seems to work fine. So now we'll upload the sensor. And once we've uploaded it, it is ready for use into your tasks and your logical scenarios. So this ends the video on the definition of your own sensor. There is much more to be said about advanced properties in sensor definition, so there will be follow-up videos that also explain that.